それでは皆さんの、スマートフォンに、アプリケーションがダウンロードできたと思いますので、基調講演の方を始めさせていただきます。まず最初に、ヘンリー・ディ・スミスさん、に基調講演を行っていただきます。ヘンリー・ディ・スミス2世さんは、ニューヨークにあるコロンビア大学東アジア言語文化学部名誉教授であられます。アメリカの大学生の海外研修プログラムである京都アメリカ大学コンソーシウムのディレクターをされています。スミス教授は戦前の日本の学生運動に関する論文を執筆し、日本初の学生過激派及び新人会の研究、日本の学生運動の源流を出版されています。最近の著作では、赤穂事件を日本の物語の統一された歴史として、その後の多くの段階や文学作品のバージョンと統合するために、忠臣蔵の歴史的側面を扱っています。最近、京都市の近代史と京都がいかにして現代日本の伝統の意味の継続的な再解釈の焦点となったかについて、研究に目を向け始めています。広重名所江戸百景、北斎富国百景、広近明治日本の芸術家など、浮世絵に関する著作も、あります。では、ヘンリー・ディ・スミス2世さん、よろしくお願いいたします。
皆さん、おはようございます。This talk was arranged almost 2 years ago, and I've been working on it for 2 years, so I've learned so much. And I'm trying to compress it today into something shorter. I am a historian, and my basic interest is in the urban culture of Japan in the 19th century, that is late Edo to Meiji. In particular, I try to look across the Edo-Meiji political border of 1868 to see both continuities as well as the obvious disruptions. Today, I want to do this for Woodlock color prints, the history of which has come down to something like this. This is the standard history. In the course of the Meiji period, the Nishiye print, as it was then called, entered a final period of decadence, decay, collapse, and finally death. But then the Woodlock color print was revived in the Taisho period from 1912 in the form of two wholly new movements, Shinhanga and Sosaku Hanga. I want to suggest that this argument is misguided and historically incorrect, and that there was much more continuity and creative development in the Meiji period than this simplistic scheme would allow. In particular, I want to focus on what I call mid-Meiji, by which I mean roughly the decade of the Meiji 20s, from 1887 to 1896. In the Western calendar, the 1890s would be close enough. Late 80s, early 90s, essentially. An incredible period of change in Japan generally. In terms of Meiji history, this period was punctuated by the promulgation of the Meiji Constitution in 1889, an event of huge significance, and then the first election from the Diet the following year, and by the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, which would ultimately, really the first event of modern Japanese imperialism and militarism that would ultimately lead to a second war in China in 1937 and onto the Pacific War. So momentous events. Okay, now go on to my slides here. First, I want to begin with what in Confucian terms would be called a rectification of names. Seimei, nao tadasu. A quick review of the meanings and history of two crucial terms namely Ukioe and Nishiye. I suspect some of you may also have wondered what the difference is between these two. So first, Ukioe. This word, I'm just reading from the screen that you see here, this word came into use from the 1680s when ukiyo referred primarily to the Yoshiwara brothel and the kabuki theater. When used alone, ukioe usually referred to paintings, not prints. The compound ukioeshi appeared soon after as a painter of the floating world, not a master of ukiyo-e. Ukiyo divides between the a and the shi. Ukiyo-e, ukio-eshi. Eshi is a painter. The most common later romanization was Ukiyoe, Y-E, perhaps as the word Edo was romanized Yedo in the Meiji period. People actually pronounced it that way once upon a time, and eventually simplified as Ukioe, without italics in Webster's International Dictionary, indicating that it has been naturalized into the English language. The version Ukiyoe, replacing yo with o, that was Ukioe, used by Fenollosa in 1896, and Fick's book that I'll mention later, very popular in 1915, is simply a misspelling. So now let's turn to Azuma Nishiye. This term was coined by the sophisticated coterie of Harunobu in 1765 to describe the new full-color technique of printing first used that year. By full color, I mean they cover the entire surface of the print, leaving a small amount of white in reserve, perhaps for text on the top or for the faces of people. That had not been true before, where there's a big white background. So full means the whole surface. The prefix Azuma, east, refers to the city of Edo, indicating a pride of independence from Kyoto, where the term Nishiye seems to have been used previously to refer to it, in Japanese, in Edo, it would be called an oshie, a kind of bas-relief doll on a piece of wood. Hagoita sometimes are done this way, made from scraps of brocade fabric. Brocade is nishiki. So they were declaring a certain independence from the old capital. The Azuma prefix was eventually dropped in common usage, and Nishiye remained the standard term for large oban, the standard large size prints made in Edo, Tokyo, often in a triptych format, 3 sheets, San Matsuzuki, until the end of the Meiji period. They had a public presence in their conspicuous display in the shop fronts of what were called the ezoshiya, the booksellers' stores, where they would be hung up and people could see them, and they were colorful because they wanted to attract attention, of course. Finally, the term Nishiye was never used for prints in Kyoto or Osaka, nor for books printed in color, which were a rich legacy, or for many other homely uses of the color woodblock technique, which I will be mentioning some shortly. I was drawn myself into the issue of the death of ukiyo-e by an interest in the sudden explosion of the use of a strong new blue color in the late 1820s, the late Bunsei period, when I stumbled across this lovely print that you see on the left in executed entirely in blue, several shades of blue, the appearance of which corresponded exactly to the description of a print in an Edo bookseller's diary of precisely such a fan print appearing in the summer of 1829. They were called Aizuri, printed in blue. The print was in the collection of the Brooklyn Museum of Art, where it rests today, and was brought to my attention by the then curator of Asian art, Amy Poster. It remains the only surviving specimen of what was titled in the bookseller's diary as a landscape of China, Todo no Fuke. The word "ai" means indigo, and there were precedents for Aizuri prints using that natural dye, but the new color was much brighter and much bluer. It was Prussian blue, known in Japanese by the Dutch term Berlin blue, shortened in Japanese to bero. This important synthetic pigment had been discovered in Germany in the early 18th century and quickly spread around the world. It was known in Japan from the 1760s, with a key reference to it in a work of Hiraga Gennai, a man of many talents and interests, who incidentally may have been responsible for coining the term Azuma Nishiye for the new technique of full surface color printing by Harunobu and his friends. Looking into the matter, I uncovered important research by a Japanese scholar about trade records for imported medicines and pigments. Medicines and pigments were always the same business, really, in all traditional parts of the world. And the same substances were used both as medicines and colorants. These records revealed, as you can see on the graph here, a sudden drop in the price. Well, this is just the amount of the imports. Anyway, there was a sudden drop in the price and increase in the volume of Prussian blue pigment imported from China, in contrast to the high prices and diminishing volume brought in by the Dutch ships from Europe at Nagasaki. Even before this statistical evidence, a Japanese art historian had proposed that the Chinese may have managed to manufacture Prussian blue on their own, bero. I was initially doubtful, and particularly in the first version of my article in Japanese, I said so, but the hypothesis was subsequently proved correct when British international trade reports revealed the existence of a Chinese bero Prussian blue factory in Canton, near the North Gate. More recently, and you see it on the screen here, I found evidence that such a factory was constructed precisely in the year 1822. This is the smoking gun of the construction, a tiny notice in a British trade journal in India. I am grateful to Google for finding it for me. You know, the world of our research today is, okay, yeah. It's a humble example of the myriad ways in which the internet has utterly transformed historical research as well as all other research in the last 25 years. The Asen fan print led directly to the first prints in Hokusai's 36 views of Mount Fuji beginning in late 1829. These were all executed with the key block outline in indigo and the color blocks in different shades of bero. From this point on, Prussian blue has remained the dominant blue in all Japanese woodcut color wood blocks and remains, I'm pretty sure, the preference today for Moku Hanbei printers throughout the world. The same general outlines, and this is not the slide I wanted. The same general outlines of the story would be repeated 4 decades later in the 1860s, as I wrote at the end of my article. This was in the mid-90s that my article came out, with the import of a new generation of chemically manufactured pigments from Europe, the aniline dyes that would become such a familiar feature of early Meiji prints. We now know this is not true, but that's what I believed and everyone else did then. Now, however, the colors were different. Rather than the strong blue and green enabled by Berlin blue, the principal hues were purple and red. Although the details of this new chapter in the history of color and culture in popular prints remain to be investigated, again, I was talking 20 years ago, more than that, 30 years ago, remain to be investigated, a similar change in popular consciousness seems clearly to have been at work. with aniline purple and red serving effectively to express the assertive new regime of civilization and enlightenment. With the Meiji Restoration, red became the modal color of another era with other priorities. Where late Edo blue was the color of expanding space, I wrote, Meiji red was to become the color of accelerated time. I still think that's pretty much the case. The idea of actually investigating the nature of the new Meiji reds and purples remained in the back of my mind for a full decade after the Blue Revolution article appeared in its English version, not until 2004. When in the spring of 2014, now over 7 years ago, Marco Leona, the chief scientist at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, who will be presenting on just this issue, I think it's tomorrow in real time, in a talk, and I urge you to look at that for the scientific details. The single most important finding, you see on the left is the abstract that appeared in the journal Heritage Science, and you can easily just find this on the internet. At any rate, the single most important finding was, as you see in this graph here, the finding was that a strong new red appeared suddenly in 1869, the second year of Meiji. We can even date it pretty much the month, about the second month of 1869. And it was not a synthetic aniline dye at all, but cochineal, a red insect dye from Central America, and the most highly prized red textile dye in Europe from the later 16th century, when the Spanish began importing it in large quantities from Central America, from what was then Mexico. By the 19th century, Guatemala, after the Mexican Empire broke up, was the chief producer. The determination that the long prized benibana, which was made from the blossoms of the safflower, you see on the left here, and just has a huge cultural history in Japan, particularly prized for cosmetics. Anyway, the determination that benibana had been replaced at the start of Meiji by a natural animal dye that had been used for centuries in the Western Hemisphere flew in the face of the long-standing belief, which I myself shared, that their commercial spread from the 1860s, that they had flooded Japan soon after the synthetic dyes had flooded Japan. Soon after their commercial spread from the 1860s, they were invented basically in England in the mid-1850s, and that this made a disastrous impact on the color quality of Japanese Nishiye. On the right, you see those little white dots. Those are bugs. Those are the cochineal insects that feed on the nopal cactus and are then harvested, and they make this beautiful red juice. Actually, if you crush them in your fingers will turn reddish purple. So as a historian, I became immediately curious about how exactly this belief that aniline dyes had taken over Nishiye, how this belief had originated and spread. It's taken me some time to track down the roots of what we might today call a conspiracy theory, or at least misinformation. But I think now I have the answer about its source. And this is it. I'll tell you in my next slide about the man who wrote this, but in 1886, this appeared in William Anderson's book, The Pictorial Arts of Japan. 1886, so just at the beginning of the period that interests me now. He wrote, from 1830, a decadence set in. This is in the history of woodblock prints. He has a whole section about what then was called chromoxylography in Victorian England. From 1830, a decadence set in. the colors became crude and were no longer balanced with the happy daring of Toyokuni, who had died in 1825. It was the adoption of cheap European pigments that gave the coup de grace and the color sense of the people, the Japanese people, after having been trained for generations by the tender harmonies of the Torii and Katsugawas, was first to be shocked and then perverted by the chromatic discords that in the present day have transformed the shops of the single sheet vendors, these are the ezoshia, into places to be passed with an averted head. They were so bad you couldn't look at them, this is what he's saying. It's a remarkable statement, and I think this really determined the course of all thinking about the history of ukiyo-e for many years after that. And specifically, this critical passage firmly established two assertions that would prove very, very long-lived. First, that Nishiye prints entered a period of decadence from 1830. That's the start of the Tempo period. That's when Prussian blue entered and became the dominant blue. And second, that a key factor in that decadence was the introduction of cheap European pigments. This could, of course, have happened only 3 decades after 1830, because the pigments did not yet exist, and only following the opening of Yokohama to free trade in 1859. To understand what was going on here, we need to know who William Anderson was and how his experiences lie behind this passage. He was really a pivotal figure in the Western understanding of Japanese arts and crafts in the 19th century. So let me provide a quick biography here. You see the main dates on the right here. He was a medical doctor with special skills in both anatomy and surgery. He was also a gifted artist on his own. He did wonderful anatomical drawings, and there are reports of his classes where he would start up the class by making an anatomical drawing, and at the end he would have this beautiful drawing on the board. He was already well into his career as a surgeon when he was chosen to travel to Japan to teach in a new school attached to the Imperial Naval Hospital in Tokyo. He arrived in 1873 and taught the first cohort of 11 students in English with an interpreter. He himself had a long-standing, I mentioned he had a long-standing interest in drawings, and naturally began to take an interest in Japanese art, which he saw all around him. He amassed a huge number of Japanese paintings, which he took back with him to London after his 7-year stay in 1880. The next year, he sold his entire collection of over 3,000 paintings to the British Museum, where they remain today. Just go to the British Museum website and look for William Anderson, and you can see hundreds and hundreds of them. He resumed a busy career as a doctor back in London, but devoted much of his spare time to studying the history of Japanese art, resulting in a massive book, The Pictorial Art of Japan, 5 years later, in 1886, from which I have just quoted. He died in London in 1900 at the age of 58, having never returned to Japan again. So looking at the timing, when Anderson wrote in 1886 about passing the shops of single sheet vendors, which so offended his eyes, he can only have been referring to the 1870s, when he was actually in Tokyo, living in Japan. As it happens, the prints he likely saw then were of the sort that might have been particularly shocking to him. Some of these were, this is one of many, many triptychs, there are about 300 of them were produced, triptychs of the Saxuma Rebellion, illustrating the Saxuma Rebellion. They were sort of like newspapers at the time, even though they were generally inaccurate. And they were very violent and very red, as you can see. The red, we now know, is cochineal, not some offensive European dye. And when we zoom in on this detail here, we remember that Anderson was a surgeon who tried to heal wounds. We can well imagine he might have been upset at prints of this sort. Prints like this represent a streak of tabloid journalism that runs throughout the Meiji period. We now know that the red was not a cheap European pigment, but rather high-class carmine. But this does not mitigate the use to which it was put here. We should also note that the war in Kyushu directly affected Anderson, since he was required by the government to travel to Kumamoto with his medical students, his class of 11, to attend to the wounded, obliging them to postpone their graduation for a full year. Anderson's time in Japan also corresponded exactly to the era of the so-called Shimbun Nishiye, newspaper Nishiye, from 1874 to 1876, that illustrated sensational stories from the newspapers in single sheet prints like this one. Note that this is also a very good example of the early use of the single most conspicuously new synthetic dye in the purple border around it. This is a bright purple known as methyl violet. It is an aniline dye, the only one that really qualifies for that name in common use, and seen here in the wide border. So, by a striking coincidence, Anderson was in Japan precisely when rather shocking and strongly colored, truly bloody prints were very visible in the single sheet vendors he mentions. Let me return to Anderson's basic assertion that in 1886, made in 1886, that from 1830, so that was about half a century earlier, a decadence set in. This declaration would become the basis of all Western accounts of the history of what were now coming to be known as ukiyo-e. Unlike Japan, where single sheet prints on public display were always called nishiye, never ukiyo-e. Over the next 3 decades, a variety of Western language books about the general history of what were now coming to be called ukiyo-e were published. Here I show only the most general and influential works in English. A very important article by Fenellosa for an exhibition held in England and then in Japan in 1996. Then Lawrence Binion, a very gifted, famous poet who also took an interest in ukiyo-e in 1912. Wait a minute. Binion was, I'm losing my track here. Paintings in the Far East, yeah, that's Binion. You're a very famous poet. Read the Wikipedia article. And then, Gukin, who was a curator, he was in charge of the collection at the University of Chicago, at the Chicago Institute of Fine Arts. And finally, thick tracts on Japanese prints, which was by far the most widely read history of ukiyo-e. Despite some variations in the specific dates when the decadence began, all of these books have reveal a common conception of the shape of the history of ukiyo-e, forcing it inevitably into a fundamentally European conception of any given particular art form as having a life cycle. The one preferred by Gukin in 1912 was that of an English scholar of Renaissance art who proposed that all art forms went through stages corresponding to the embryonic, the adolescent, the matured, the decadent, and the exhausted. I'm in the exhausted stage right now. In European art, the embryonic and adolescent came to be known as the primitive works, a term assigned then to early stage of all ukiyo-e from Moronobu to Harunobu. Then came Japan's classical stage of the matured to what came to be called, and I can't find out who began this, but now very widely it's called the Golden Age of ukiyo-e. From Harunobu to, well, the end date is debated, but it ranged from 1793 when Kiyonaga published his last full-size prints, at the earliest, to Anderson's first choice of 1830 at the latest. After this, all was consigned to decadence, a term that passed into the standard term in Japanese as well. Hai-tai or tai-hai, it's called for late Nishiye. So this was the standard pattern already set in motion by Anderson of the history of the color woodblock print that's passing through a primitive period until Harunobu and the invention of Azuma Nishiye, then a golden age corresponding to the classical perfection of the High Renaissance. And after that, all was decadence, which in Europe would correspond to the Baroque and Rococo periods. In effect, Anderson had poisoned the well of the accepted history of the Japanese color woodblock print, a consensus that would reign dominant for almost a century. But the relegation of all Nishiye after 1830 to decadence was wholly contradicted by the huge admiration in the West, then as now, for the landscape prints of Hokusai and Hiroshige. So that an explicit exception was persistently made for these two giants. Guken described it as a brief renaissance. I think Fenellosa said it was a revival, but it was most expressively described. This is Hokusai and how can you explain Hokusai and Hiroshige as decadent? Ficke in his 1915 book described Hokusai and Hiroshige's landscapes as a beautiful island in the midst of a sea of wrecks. I'm not sure how do you translate wrecks? It's a wonderful word in English. He was a poet too, by the way. And wrote that these two artists, H and H, I always abbreviate them to myself, must be registered as a new shoot sent up by the roots of a tree whose main trunk had already fallen into irreparable decay. There's all these D words, degradation, decay, death. So, on to James Michener. The left is Michener as he appeared in around 1952 when he wrote his book, The Floating World, about the Japanese woodblock print. And on the right, in his avuncular old age, which is much more familiar, he looks a little shrewd and cunning on the left, which is what I feel when I read what he wrote about the prints. This is the first edition that you see on the left, and you can see the fine print on the bottom. He says, an account of the life and death of an art. This idea of the death of Ukioe is now made very explicit by this very influential book. And in that passage that he describes about the death of the art, which he deals with mainly Kunisada and Kuniyoshi, both of whom he hated, and not even mentioning Meiji prints, which he'd never looked at, I think, he wrote, and this is really this rivals Anderson. When vile German aniline dyes reached Japan, all restraint disappeared, and some of the most grotesque prints ever issued flooded the shops. He is really almost quoting Anderson. I really think that's what he was looking at. It was the debasement, another D word, of a beautiful and sensitive art. No pre-aniline print is quite the complete horror that most of the post-aniline prints are. So, I have to step back now, and the period I'm talking about in mid-Meiji, when the word Ukioe, as it was generally romanized, and never, as I mentioned before, never used to describe contemporary Nishiye of late Edo or Meiji, took on a new life in its romanized form. Again, typically with the hyphen YE at the end, by dealers who had discovered a growing and very profitable market in older prints, those leading up to and including the Golden Age, plus, of course, Hokusai and Hiroshige. Such prints left Japan for both Europe and America in huge numbers, selling at ever higher prices throughout the 1890s and right on into the 1920s. Competition for these old and increasingly rare prints was acute. The prices were phenomenal. I mean, there were hundreds of dollars in the 1890s, which means thousands, even tens of thousands of dollars now. In Japan, such older prints were known as konishiye. Sounds like a sumo wrestler, but no, konishiye means old nishiye. Or just koe, old pictures. That is antique prints, basically, prints over 100 years old. In contrast to the contemporary nishiye of the Bakumatsu and Meiji period, none of which were of any interest to any foreign collector. They were too cheap. In other words, the historical scheme begun by William Anderson in 1886, condemning all prints after 1830 except for Hokusai and Hiroshige as decadent, became so widely accepted that there was simply no market for Bakumatsu Meiji prints, seen as being destroyed by imported synthetic colors from the West. It was not really until the 1980s, I got the wrong slide here, wait a minute. Well, disregard the image on the left, no, okay, here we go. It was not really until the 1980s, some 3 decades after Michener's Floating World, that there began to emerge among Japanese and American scholars alike of Japanese color prints, a far more positive evaluation of Meiji artists. Above all, Yoshitoshi, here on the left is the title page of Roger Keyes, who died just a year ago. It was his dissertation, it was a PhD dissertation that he wrote, an account of the Yoshitoshi collection in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And it is a masterpiece, easily available on the internet, never published as a proper book. And on the right then, Julia Meach's very important work of, I'm trying to think, around 1986, The World of the Meiji Print. So it just opened up I wouldn't say floodgates, but a lot of new scholarship over the 20 or 30 years in between about Meiji prints. Here, for example, are 2 books by John Stevenson, commentaries on the 2 great series of Yoshitoshi, the 36 Ghosts, and the 100 Views of the Moon, Skihakuji. And these appeared in I think the one on the left was in the late 80s, and the one on the right in the early 90s. And then there are all these string of fairly recent books. You see the dates at the bottom here. On the left, Bruce Coates. Most of these were exhibitions, so the exhibition catalogs, but very important research. On Shikanobu by Bruce Coates in 2006. The remaining 3 are all by Amy Regal Newland, who's been a one-man factory of producing these books, and they're all published by the same publisher, Hote, now part of Brill, in Leiden under the skillful direction of Chris Uhlenbeck. I want to now turn to other ways in which color woodblock prints would have come into the lives of Japanese in the mid-Meiji period, other than passing in front of bookstores where you see them hung up to attract attention. And this is a wonderful book by Rebecca Salter. In which she describes woodblock printed items. It's on paper, generally in much smaller sizes, and intended for a wide range of both practical and devotional uses. Rebecca Salter's book, you see her on the right. She is now the president of the British Royal Academy of Arts, very distinguished position. And it's really required reading for all interested in the very wide range of uses to which popular color woodblock printing was put in the late Edo and Meiji period, even on to the present. Just for One example is Chiyogami. Chiyogami is woodblock printed paper. It's still woodblock printed today by stores like, is it Haibara in Tokyo? And I think there's a couple of places in Kyoto as well that still use woodblock printing to produce Chiyogami, used for wrapping things, basically, or decoration. And they're really, it's a marvelous exhibition of Japanese design talent that was spreading. And this is mostly a Tokyo examples here, but it also flourished in Kyoto as well. These could also be used for origami. That was another popular use for paper like this. Another very important use was for what are called Senjafuda or nosatsu. That's how I met Rebecca Salter. We were both very interested in an interesting American anthropologist named Frederick Starr, who was in Japan in the 1910s and 20s and became a great collector and producer of Senjafuda. You've seen them all when you go to temples and shrines. They're pasted up, sometimes in very high places. A lot of places discourage the practice now, but others actually do encourage it. This is from Doi-san, an important scholar of this period, today. These are contemporary Senjafuda. And Rebecca Salter discovered when she came to Japan and began, one of her projects was to interview surviving traditional artisans. She found that one important way they were still making a living was to make custom-made Senjafuda for the collectors, who would then go around and paste them, sometimes in groups. There were these nosatsu kai groups, particularly active in the Taisho period. So these are just ways in which she writes about many other things, kinds of wrapping, certain kind of prints. It's a wonderful book, and she's an artist herself. I should mention, Rebecca Salter began her career studying in Kyoto, first ceramics, but she quickly changed to woodblock prints and studied under Kurosaki Akira for 2 or 3 years, I think. So she began as a woodblock print artist. What she does now, and I'll show you at the end of my talk, are much more abstract kind of things, and all paintings. Okay, now I want to turn to the ways in which the Ukioe technique, as opposed to the actual prints. I think it's useful to Nishiye, on the one hand, it's a way of woodblock color printing, and has been passed down to this day with the basic same characteristic of 3 W's: wood, water, washi, some pigments, of course, some additives like alum and glue and nori, and 2 critical tools: the Kinto system of registration and the Batten rubbing tool. People have made lots of variations in that set of characteristics, but they mostly remain the same. So I like to use Nishiye to refer to that technique versus the genre of Nishiye in Meiji period, which did start to disappear. So Nishiye, the Oban prints on display in the bookstores during the Meiji period was in a state of gradual decline. There's no doubt about it. In the face of competition from magazines, newspapers, although newspapers weren't in color, of course, and particularly from 1900 by picture postcards. And all of these prints were almost entirely dismissed by Western aficionados as decadent and degraded. The threat from color postcards may seem hard to believe today. We don't use them anymore, do we? I don't. But in the late 19th century, they were basically the Instagram of the day. It was a global phenomenon, color postcards, and in Japan as well. And a lot of the Ezoshiya pulled down their Nishiye prints and started having big displays of little postcards, which were much cheaper and easier to collect. But meanwhile, As a technique, Nishiye has invented, in the way I just described it, in 1765, reached its perceived peak of artistic quality according to the standard account in the Oban prints of Kiyonaga, exactly 1 century earlier in the 1780s and 1790s. In fact, the Ukiyoe technique was reaching new heights of technical perfection in mid-Meiji and expanding into new and innovative areas. And this is what I want to finish on, these 3 specific topics. First, the appearance of the what we call Zuan-shu or Zuan-sho in Kyoto, and the central role of the publisher Unsodo. Second, the emergence of new techniques and a new audience for reproducing old paintings at a reduced size by adopting the Nishiye technique, mainly in the publication of the art journal Kokka. And finally, the beginnings of the spread of the Japanese color woodblock technique among artists in France, England, and America. I'm beginning in Kyoto with the Zuanshu, they were called. On the left is a very important book edited by Hida, I forget his first name. But anyway, a very important study of, you see, Meiji Taisho Zuanshu no Kenkyu, a big, beautiful book with a huge catalog of known, these are all books, remember, we're not talking about single sheet prints anymore. A very valuable reference book. I think this appeared in 2004. And on the right are just the headings of 2 articles by Scott Johnson, who lives in Kyoto and has been a great collector of various interesting things. But one of them was Zuanshu. And he sold his entire collection to the British Museum. So just go to the British Museum website and look up Scott Johnson, and you'll find lots of beautiful, beautiful books, all digitized by now. These 2 articles appeared in the Dutch English language journal that's devoted to all the Japanese crafts, but prints in particular, named called Andon. One right after the other. The first is more detailed on the history. The second has more pictures to it. Scott Johnson opened his first article with this explanation of why it was from the late 80s into the 1890s that suddenly there was this explosion of printed books of designs. He wrote, from the 1890s, the kimono world of Kyoto became increasingly industrialized. Stencils, he's referring here to what is known as the Utsushi Yuzen technique, where the resist paste was used actually with, in fact, synthetic dyes through a stencil to make it much cheaper to apply the Yuzen patterns for kimonos. So stencils and imported synthetic dyes expanded the color palette and reduced the time required for the dyeing of fabrics. And jacquard looms, of which you see here a photo of a model that's in the Nishijinori Museum in Kyoto today, sped up the weaving process. These improvements in the speed of production intensified the demand for designs. With the export market for fabrics a particular target, both weavers and dyers sought fresh design ideas. To fill this need, design schools were established, and local publishers rejuvenated the old tradition of woodblock printed pattern books. Here you see a very interesting example on the left, dating from 1725, a page from what were called hinagatabon, pattern books, basically. There were lots of these. They were all printed in black on white. They were references for essentially sometimes customers, sometimes designers, and you actually see them in Ukioe and Nishiye themselves, people using them. So 1725 on the left, and then suddenly it was reprinted, exactly the same pattern. They simply cut new blocks for it in 1886. This is really one of the earliest, what came to be called the modern Kyoto Zuanshu. It now is renamed Naniwa no Ume, the plums of Naniwa, and a very revealing example of what has come in the dramatic use of color in particular, which at this point in 1886 would have been cochineal carmine. Carmine, by the way, was the term used for the pigmented form of the cochineal dye. So 1886, it's beautiful. And then in 1891, this is from one of Scott Johnson's articles, the real start of Kyoto Zuanshu was in the early 1890s, such as this 1891 publication of fan designs based on the work of Uata Korin, who Korin was a major inspiration for the whole Meiji Zuan movement in Kyoto, a basic strand of which came to be known as Neo-Rinpa, that is after Korin school. The publisher in this case was Tanaka Jihei of Bunkyudo, an early leader in Zuan publications. In the same year of 1891, it was in the same year as the previous print of 1891 that Yamada Naosaburo, who had apprenticed under Tanaka Jihei, founded his own firm, Unsodo. It was the next year, as you see on the screen here, that he published the 2-volume work Koge Shinzu, New Craft Design, with elaborate and innovative designs. Just a few examples here. I think you can go to the copy in the British Museum and see them. They're absolutely gorgeous. These are book size, they're not big book size. There's note, and let me also mention that if you go to Unsodo today, I'm going to say a little bit more about Unsodo now. You can buy this book entitled Bijutsukai, which was a journal that Unsodo put out from, I think, around 1896 until 1903 or so, a regular journal. And this is a collection of some of the designs, if you just want to look through the kind of designs that were being made. Here you see the appearance of Unsodo on the upper left as it looked in 1929. And below its storefront today, it's on Teramashi, just south of Nijoka. Yeah. Anyway, so Unsodo has been around for 130 years now, and it's amazing history. So this is the showroom here on the right, where they sell a variety of art books, including a number of reprints of works using the original blocks. They continued woodblock printing for decades, into the 1930s at least, and they've reprinted many works since then using the same blocks. So they stored all the blocks, and the most remarkable achievement of Unsodo of all is its storehouse. It's called the Hangigura, which is right in back of the main store. Here you see Hayamitsu Teruko, who's been a huge help to me, and now, unfortunately, Yoshi-san died a few years ago. She knows no more about the history of Unsodo than anyone else. So she's been a full-time employee there for about 40 years, since the early 90s. I recently asked her how many blocks were stored on the two-story building, just crammed with all these packages wrapped in old newspapers. So if you look at the date of the newspaper, you can tell when they were last used or opened up. So I asked her how many blocks were stored on these 2 floors, and she said no inventory had ever been made, and no one has any idea how many blocks there are. She said that when asked, she suggests a guess of about 100,000 blocks. I think that's probably an exaggeration, but really no one does know. And you feel like that, and you see all these wooden blocks crammed into that storehouse. At any rate, I would personally rate the Hangigura of Unsodo as a national treasure, or at least an important cultural property, Juyo Bunkarai. I worry, if it were ever to burn down, wouldn't it be a tragedy? If any of you would like to see it, I'm sure Hayami-san will be delighted to show you. It is our wood. So for any woodblock printmaker, it's a phenomenon. Really, I've visited it a number of times. And Hayami-san has pulled out some of the blocks so I can study the actual blocks that were carved in the Meiji period. There's nothing like seeing the real thing. I now move back to Tokyo into another set of important developments in color woodblock printing in this critical period in the late 80s and into the 1890s, namely the sudden increase in the use of woodblock printing to reproduce older works of various different kinds. On the one hand, the soaring demand among collectors for genuine prints of the Golden Age, plus Hiroshige and Hokusai, naturally invited woodblock printmakers to produce copies of prints in high demand. Reproducing a Nishiye print is an extremely simple matter, as you can all imagine, since the necessary steps are built into the technique itself. A key block can be replicated with a high degree of accuracy by sacrificing an existing specimen and using it as the hanshai, as the block-ready print, for a new edition. It's called kabusebori. Since all prints in their nature are, after all, reproduction, this is its tricky waters here. The key question is whether the intention of making these facsimiles was to deceive, or forgeries basically, or wholly non-deceptive reproductions that openly declared their nature. At any rate, they flooded the market. This kind of reproduction not only exists today, but it has been a major way to keep the craft of woodblock printing and carving and printing alive and commercially viable. I show you here the website of Adachi Hanga in Tokyo, the oldest surviving such enterprise, and apparently doing very well today, training new craftsmen. And so, working to keep the old craft tradition alive. But also from the 1880s, there emerged a wholly new demand for the use of the technique of color woodblock to replicate not old prints, but old paintings. And since many traditional paintings were in formats larger than the oban size, of course, this meant reducing the size by some reliable method. And that method was photography. The most influential technique that was developed for this task appeared in the journal Kokka. You see a cover on the left, which the first issue was published at the end of 1889, I think in November of 1889, as a monthly magazine that continues to this day as the most prestigious, I think it's fair to say, of all the many now journals of Japanese art history. And one distinguishing feature from the very beginning was the use of the color woodblock technique to produce reduced size facsimiles of mostly Japanese, but also a number of Chinese paintings as well. On the right, you see a wonderful photo of the Kokka workshop in the late Meiji period, where they had a lot of people. I counted about 15 people here hard at work on this task. Every issue of Kokka on into at least into the 1910s had generally 2 of these reproductions, and they were really very beautiful. And you can pick them up actually in Honda or other places as well. So here I'm showing you one example of a very, very important paper that was written by a student whom I had the pleasure to teach at the University of Chicago in the spring of 2016, Sandy Lin. And let me just quickly take you through the way they did this. On the left, you have an actual photograph of the Jigoku Zoshi, a particular famous painting, as it survives today. Very badly damaged. On the right, you have a grayscale photo. Simply, I just took, chose clicked on grayscale on my computer to produce this. That sort of photo on the right is what was used to begin the process. It was printed in a technique known as collotype, which produces very fine detail, with that becomes the basis for the key block. In other words, a photograph, something like that. And then they can just, trace over that or turn it over some way of the first stage. So they make a monochrome print using the collotype process at the exact size for which they would make the reproduction. You see, at this time, photography could magnify and reduce to any size. That had not been possible, 20 years earlier. So photography was very important to this. So this one of these prints will be used as the key block, different from usual key blocks, which were all executed in precise ink drawings. So to guide the carver, a second photo print was hand painted over by a person in a wholly new role known as the gakko. Gakko is another word for painter. Gakka, eshi, means the same thing, but it wasn't used very much, and there was no such person in the traditional process of making Nishiye. So this gakko essentially replaced the designer, taking the photograph, going over it, and then at the next stage, after they printed off a number of copies of the key block, assigning the colors. That is another with a brush, by hand painted brush, the gakko would show what colors would be used, and then they would make the color blocks. The Kokuka method required at least 40 to 50 color blocks for each print, and sometimes over 100 or more. Sometimes they were just one little detail for one block, apparently. These do not survive as far as I know. At any rate, so what do we have here? It is not in any scientific sense. So this is, on the left is, on the right, this is from Sandy's wonderful article. On the right is the way it looks, I guess today, or whenever that photograph was taken. It's in the Nara National Museum. And on the left is the Kokuka reproduction. It's been tidied up. It's been restored, if you will. What is it really? No one wants to look at a photograph on the right if you can have the one on the left. For a purist, you got to see the real thing. But for someone just appreciating the art, this is not only good enough, but wonderful. So this is really the beginning of full color art printing in Japan using woodlock. There was no other printing method that could really do this except for lithography. And lithography, I did not mention that William Anderson's book of 1886 on the pictorial arts of Japan had about 50 beautiful, exquisite lithograph reproductions of various Japanese craft objects and paintings as well, many of them from Anderson's own collection. And the Kokuka method was basically created as a way of competing with lithography. The Japanese could have used lithographs themselves. The Japanese can make anything after all. But they wanted to compete with color lithography. And that was explicit. They wanted to give jobs to the craftsmen who were now increasingly in threat of their livelihood as Nishiye themselves were being threatened. At any rate, so it was not in any scientific sense an exact copy, although it was made from photographs, so a very exact copy of the two-dimensional form, but rather a recreation by hand. There's no mechanics involved with this at all, and not so very different when you think about it from the often extensive restorations that modern conservators attempt to achieve with techniques that are wholly manual and never mechanical. This was the kind of achievement made by the Kokuka woodblocks long before the very idea of scientific restoration emerged in the 20th century. I also mentioned as a quick follow-up that the same Kokuka technique, absolutely the same technique, was used by a company named Shinbi Shoin, which in 1899 began producing huge, beautiful, really huge. I mean, just to lift up one of these from the Columbia Library was a task for me. Books of reproductions, woodblock reproductions, the same method of famous historical paintings in multi-volume series. The first was Shinbi Kaikan, all Japanese art. You see here on the left, one of the kind of falling apart from the Columbia Library, entitled Toyo Bijutsu Taikan, which had both Japanese and Chinese art in 15 volumes. First was 20 volumes. They produced about one volume a year over a long period of time. The company Shinbi Shoin continued into the 1930s with further series and the active sale of single copies of the prints well into the 1930s. They promoted the export of these beautiful artworks, which may be found in many libraries throughout the world. As I mentioned, Columbia has a huge collection, but they're also in many American libraries, mostly stored away in a place where they store large books. After the war, that's a quick postmark here, postscript, after the war, Shinbi Shoin was incorporated into Benrido in Kyoto, itself a product of Meiji as a publisher of art reproductions in collotype, the process used for the Kokuka method. They were mostly black and white, but you may know Benrido in Kyoto as a company that runs many of the shops in museums today, as well as doing exquisite monochrome prints of high-resolution photographs, and apparently is said to be the only surviving color collotype printer in the world today. Okay, last section, I want to talk about these pioneers of the Japanese woodblock technique in the mid-Meiji period. This international setting, we find simultaneous but largely unrelated emergence of an interest in the Japanese colored woodblock technique in France, England, and America. Partly this was because of the new knowledge of Japanese colored prints thanks to the boom in the trade in these years, but also because there seems to have been emerging among Western artists a variety of needs to which Japanese technique appealed. Each story is completely different and all are very interesting. Here I can offer only a very quick overview. On the right, next slide. So on the left, you see the cover of a 2012 catalog at the French departmental, in the department like a prefecture, departmental museum of Brittany, Bretagne, and in the city of Quimper, Quimper, which you see as a red dot in the map on the right. So just to orient yourself, you see the red dot of Quimper far out on the peninsula of Brittany. Across the channel up there is London, and then off to the right is Paris. And Brittany became a center of artistic activity in the mid and late 19th century for artists. The railway was built from Paris in 1862, so it was a very easy trip. And they would go there to basically enjoy the beautiful landscapes and to paint them. And in Pont-Aven, in particular, there's a Pont-Aven school, of which Gauguin is a leading example. The museum in Quimper, on the left, you see one of 3 exhibitions that they have held about the Japanese Bretagne collection, Japon Paris Bretagne. I was first shown these by Hayami-san of Unsodo, they had come to consult her, Unsodo, for information on the techniques. And so, yeah. So, okay, now, this print here is said to be probably the earliest one done in the Japanese technique in France. Jacqueline Basse, who's leading scholar of the revival of woodblock printing in France from the late 1880s. Remember, woodblock printing had been around in Europe for many, many years, both with the grain, Durer did mostly that, and what is called cross-grain wood engraving, where you use a different technique. I won't get into the history of wood engraving in Japan, but there was a history, and it's rather interesting. But anyway, Kathleen Bath wrote that this particular print would seem to be the first successful French attempt to imitate the Japanese woodcut technique. Technique in woodcut and woodblock, by the way, mean exactly the same thing. Woodcut was more common in the 19th century, woodblock is more common today. There's no difference. At any rate, interest in Japanese art was very high in France at this time. It was just 1 year earlier that Siegfried Bing had published the first issue of Le Japon Artistique, Artistic Japan, which would continue until April of 1891, so 3 years, with simultaneous editions in both English and German. A remarkable publication, and there's a Japanese version of it as well now. This print is not only done in the Japanese technique here, but seems clearly influenced by Japanese print. So there's both the technique and the issues of composition, of design that were involved as well. I myself can't help seeing in it a strong resemblance to the early Meiji Tokyo landscapes of Kobayashi Kiyochika, of whom I wrote a book a long time ago. In the use of strong shadows, for example, these silhouettes, the bokashi gradation along the sky. This was something which actually did originate in Europe much earlier, but it became a signature of many Japanese landscapes, particularly Hokusai and Hiroshige along the top. The artist was Lepere, Auguste Louis Lepere, and he also did this print. These are comparisons that have been done by other scholars. I didn't dream them up myself, but on the left is a woodblock print, color woodblock print. You see the bokashi along the horizon, the high horizon, the enlarged foreground figure, and it's been proposed that a print like the choki print on the left, precisely from the golden age of sunrise at New Year's, Hatsui no De, has been, they are quite striking, similar in composition in those respects. There is no rising sun on the pairs on the left, but there is the bokashi gradation. So clearly they were looking at these prints and being influenced them, not only for the technique, but for the design as well. The other crucial French figure was Henri Rivière. Here you see in the same year, apparently, but slightly later than the pair print, he was recording the building of the Eiffel Tower. And this is the workshop. You see the tower going up in the background there. This would he would continue. This was so Rivière would produce. Lost my place. So Lepere himself did not continue much further with woodblock prints, turning rather to the rival technique of color lithography. But meanwhile, his colleague Henri Rivière, who was older, would produce dozens of works in the Japanese manner, beginning with this one in 1889, and would become what was known as the 36 Views of the Eiffel Tower, explicitly following the concept of Hokusai's 36 Views of Mount Fuji. The tower was completed actually in the year this print was made, 1889, but Rivière had been sketching the process from the beginning, and the prints would continue to come out over the next couple of years. Here is a comparison that has been made from on the top, one of the 36 views of the Eiffel Tower, and below on the right from Hiroshige's Meisho Edo Hake, 100 famous views of Edo, showing this, suggesting, I think it's persuasive, where this is called the pine, Skinomatsu, the pine the moon pine. You see, so this tree, apparently there was such a tree, a pine tree, that had curled around in a way like this so that you could peek through it and see into the distance. And here from the upper story of the Eiffel Tower, the same sort of using a dramatic close background. These are, on the left is another one of these exhibitions that were held in Quimper at the Departmental Museum there, Rivière, Hiroshige, Hokusai, where they made a number of similar comparisons. You see the one on the right, on the right top is from a series called La Mer, Étude des Vagues, the sea, studies of waves. These were each 40 prints, all done by hand, all in woodblock. And on the lower right, from a different series called Paysages Bretons, Landscapes of Brittany, a lobster boat at the mouth of the Trieu River. One on the top is from 1892. These are all in the early 1890s. And in particular, the one on the lower right has been compared to, lo and behold, one of Hokusai's 36 views. Yeah, I find, is this valid? Is it not? Anyway, it's very interesting. So they were using the method, and they're beautifully done. You know, they're not very finely crafted the way a Japanese print would be, but they're very expressive, and it was really a bold graphic medium that they were tremendously appealing to the French artists. Finally, on Rivière is his masterpiece in the Japanese style woodblock medium, a 5-sheet wide print. This is in the Oban size. So such things were done in the Meiji period, actually. There were a lot of triptychs, but not many pentaptychs. And where he got this idea, it's really hard to say. So this shows an annual religious procession in Brittany. Le Pardon, it's called, the name of the ceremony of Saint Anne de Padoue. It's held every year in the end of August, and seems to today attract hundreds in the parade that you see here of people in the Breton costume. People don't wear it that much anymore, but they dress up in local costume, plus thousands of pilgrims apparently, and still goes on. The church behind was itself completed only in the 19th century, in 1864. So each sheet, if you look closely, you can kind of see where they're divided, but it's hard. Each sheet is, again, an Oban size, Japanese paper. They always printed on washi, Japanese paper, which was easily available. It required the intricate carving of 5 key blocks and some 50 color blocks, requiring more than 3 months of work by Rivière, followed by 2 months for printing 200 copies. I was able to find on the internet a copy of a single sheet. This is the one on the far left. You see, he did it sort of like a panorama, so that the procession is kind of going around the building and it keeps changing its angle. So this is the one on the far left where they're now going away, where they were arriving on the right. It's a remarkable print, or set of prints. Fantastic. So, so this is, it happens to be in the Santa Barbara Museum of Art as a single sheet. So apparently what unscrupulous dealers do often with the triptychs of the Meiji period, for example, is to cut them apart or pull them apart and sell them separately. You make more money that way. So this is the only thing they have. And if you go to the internet, you can find single sheets from this wonderful 5-piece work. So that was Rivière's masterpiece. Okay. Now moving quickly across the English Channel to London, where 3 or 4 years later in time, the English always seem to be a bit slower than the French, there was emerging a serious interest in what was known as the Japanese manner of color woodblock printing. As in France, this was a time when artists were increasingly interested in ways for themselves to break free of the grip of professional wood engravers, who worked literally across the grain in a very stylized system for representing monochrome gradations with a scheme of ever increasingly thin lines or complex cross-hatching. It was an artisanal technique that could be mastered only after long training, and that no young artist would ever wish to master. So the much greater simplicity of the Japanese manner, working with the grain, quite literally, something even a beginner could manage with a little practice, had much appeal. English artists were also well aware of the work of Lapierre and Riviere, but much slower to respond. The first evidence of the serious interest in the Japanese woodblock appeared in in an article in a new magazine called The Studio. This became a very influential art magazine in the, I think it began in 1991 or 92, and it included here, as you see on the, an article on woodcut printing in watercolors. It was basically a description. There were two articles. One was a report on the Tokuno report that Helena Wright will be talking about tomorrow in a talk. But it was also this artist, Batten. Let me just remind myself of his dates. Yeah, John Dixon Batten, describing his struggle to figure out how to make a Japanese woodblock print. There was no one to tell him how to do it. He had a version of the Tokuno account, but that didn't help him much either. So I can't go into the details, but basically he describes the Japanese color technique as being, the great appeal lay in the fact that it was water rather than oil, which is what lithography generally used. So it's really a question of oil and water here. And to this day, the International Mokuhanga Association defines the works that you're allowed to display as being water-based in the pigments. So water was a crucial element for him. And he really did not produce much of anything himself that survives at least, but a good friend of his, somewhat younger, was Frank Morley Fletcher, who went on to become slightly younger contemporary and a close acquaintance, who would go on to become the great teacher and proselytizer of the Japanese style of woodblock printing in England, which in the 1920s and 30s would emerge as a major movement of great productivity and creativity. As of 1894, Fletcher knew and would in time take very seriously the issues to be learned from the Tokuno report. But in the later 1890s, he worked mostly as a teacher for a period in Santa Barbara, California, in 1892-93, and thereafter at a number of schools in England, always teaching the Japanese method. This is a work of his that is particularly famous, iconic, one might also almost say, entitled Meadow Suite, 1896. It's a rather small print. I'd say it's about 6 inches wide, about 10 inches high. It's a rather small print, but I think one glance and you can see Hiroshige, really, this dramatic foreground view, the skillful use of bokashi, the red along the sky in the distance, upwards from the water below. It really is a joke. And the use of the shadows in the water. It's a lovely print. I would like to see the real thing someday. Anyway, it's quite well known. And Fletcher then went on to write this book in 1916, I believe it was. 1916, woodblock printing, is what he called a description of the craft of wood cutting, a color printing based on the Japanese practice. And this was a very influential book, and it's worth reading today. It's very interesting and very, very accurate. And in that book, he says at the beginning that the Tokuno report was very influential. That was their handbook, really, in trying to put this all together. Okay, finally, I want to turn briefly to the last person I'm talking about, and that was Arthur Wesley Dow in the United States. He's an interesting character. I will tell you that. So now we're crossing the Atlantic now. Before we were crossing the English Channel. Now we're in America. And there was there as well as in Europe, particularly in the big cities, Boston, New York, Chicago, St. Louis, Minneapolis actually, there were a lot of rich industrialists who vied with one another to buy and pay a lot of money for Japanese prints. Anyway, this is a view of Dow, Arthur Wesley Dow, who grew up in Ipswich, Massachusetts, and then and wanted to become a painter. So he went to France in the we went to France in the late 1880s, I think, precisely the time when there was a lot of activity there. His painting style at the time was very conservative. On the left is what he did. He didn't like color very much. It's a very bland, it's a plein air, but not very interesting. As contrasted with Gauguin, who also, about the same time, was visiting Pont-Aven, the leader of what became the school there, and using very bright colors. Dow must have seen paintings like this, and he must have felt very conflicted, because himself then went on to produce prints with a lot of color. This is his beginning interest in Japanese prints was when he came back to Ipswich. He was looking around for ideas, so he went to the Boston Public Library. He was looking for any kind of art, and he stumbled across Hokusai's manga, basically, the inspiration for almost everybody. And it just blew his mind. He just thought, wow, he'd never seen anything like this. And he became a great proselytizer of Japanese-inspired type of composition for the rest of his very productive career as a teacher, mostly in New York at Pratt Institute, and then at Columbia Teachers College. After he saw these prints at the Boston Public Library, he went to the Museum of Fine Arts, where Ernest Fenollosa, had just recently become the curator of the new Asian art department. And Fenollosa guided and supported Dow for the rest of his career. And he started making prints on his own, woodblock prints. On the left, you see the catalog, very slim catalog, at the Museum of Fine Arts, that long, narrow gallery that some of you may know if you've been there, a special exhibition of color prints. They're not calling them ukiyo-e or anything like that, just color prints by Arthur W. Dow. And they're of remarkable interest for a couple of reasons. Here you see one on the right. Let me just, you see one on the right. They're very, very small, about 2.5 inches wide by about 6-7 inches tall, tiny, tiny little prints. And he took 13 different scenes that he had sketched, drawn around where he lived in Ipswich, this port city north of Boston. And you see the Japanese influence immediately, the cutting off of things to the edge, the high landscape, and all the characteristics of it. And then for each one of these 13, he printed about 10 versions, each one with different colors. This is something no one ever did. You always print the same color, don't you? No, he was experimenting with, inking the blocks differently each time he did it. He'd wash them off and he'd start again with a different color scheme. I have not seen views of the entire set, but and here's what Fenollosa wrote about the process here. He said, it's a wonderful article, it's a rather short introduction to the work of Dow. It is the work of the individual artist from start to finish. The same designer, planner, and carver next charges his blocks with color, varying in tint, shade, and hue to any degree, and like the Japanese, in such a way that gradation is already affected before the printing. The artist is as free with his blocks as the painter with his palette. This was exactly the kind of thing that actually Tokuno, actually Sylvester Kuller, had written so impressed him about the nature of the Japanese printer that they were actually painting the blocks. They used a brush. And gradation is a form of painting, so every single one is different. And anyway, that's what now Tao is carrying to an extreme. So this is an eloquent justification for what over a decade later in Japan would come to be known as Sosakuhanga, by which a single artist did all of the stages that were previously subjected to an intricate division of labor. The same concept had already been put into practice in France in particular, but also by Fletcher in England. And to conclude, I want to mention an example of collaboration today. This is an article by Claire Cuccio. I'm going to send all these references out separately, and they'll be attached to a future version of my talk online, I believe. Claire Cuccio is a great expert in crash and Japanese prints in particular. She was a key organizer in the very first International Mokuhanga conference in Kyoto and on Awaji in 2011, as I recall. At any rate, she got to know a lot of the printers and carvers here. And she wrote this, When a Copy is an Original, the Sato Woodlock Print Workshop and Rebecca Sulzer. In this photograph, in the middle, is Kitamura Shoichi, who will be giving a talk tomorrow, I believe, and a presentation the following day, and who taught me the rudiments of carving Japanese woodblocks this past spring. I didn't get very far, I have to confess, but he taught me a lot, and I can see how hard it is, but how skillful he is too. And anyway, he is there in the workshop of Sato Keizo, a master printer whose father, I think grandfather as well, were in the trade, and is still going strong, doing a lot of special commissions. And one of those commissions came from Rebecca Sulzer. It's a series of 4 prints actually called Quadra. Just 4 of them is what it basically means. And you can see one of them, I don't think it's this one, the one sitting on the table in the photograph to the left. You see them sitting, discussing. So that's Kitamura-san in the middle, and I think that's Sato-san on the right probably, and on the left maybe is a printer. In fact, I forget exactly who is who. At any rate, this is right in Kyoto. There's still a very active workshop to this day. And it's a very interesting article describing how this incredibly finely detailed, elaborate painting, on the right it's a painting, was translated into a woodblock print. I'd be interested to see the original. Kitamura-san, I know, is working on another print of Rebecca Sulzer right now. He showed it to me in his workshop. It'll probably take a long time. But I think that this kind of collaboration leads me to conclude today with some thoughts on the many benefits of working together in the world of international mokuhanga. To be sure, most members probably work on their own, undertaking all of the 3 stages of designing, carving, and printing. But perhaps it is also worth considering a revival of what was actually common in the late Meiji period to the early Showa, of Western designers taking their work to professional publishers like Watanabe Shozaburo, who had his own, staff of carvers and printers for the Shinhanka that he created. It remains critical today to train an ongoing younger generation of dedicated carvers and printers in Japan to keep the most skilled qualities of the crafts alive. Adachi Hanga is doing this, and Dave Bull at his Mokuhankan in Tokyo is at least doing the same thing with printers. He's training young printers to do this work. That's another place you should visit. He said, oh, he's also something of a character. So that's my final thought, is that we should all work together to preserve tradition while always innovating for the future. And just thank you.
my teachers.
スミスさん、ありがとう